Hello and Happy New Year. It's January 2nd, 2021, so I thought it was high time to give you a wrap up of all the reading I did in 2020. I've been distracted by dogs moving in the background, eating stuff from the floor, cleaning themselves, yawning, butting into the phone. So this is all going very well and hopefully is not setting the mood for my filming in 2021 on the whole, because I've been super slack filming. I really enjoy talking about the books that I've read, and it just sort of fell by the side with sort of keeping up work while dealing with the train wreck of 2020. All in all, I did read 67 books though, which I'm happy with. I set the goal of reading 52 books, which I tend to do most years. I have that as a sort of rough guideline. Reading a book a week is doable for me, and generally I read less when I'm not doing great. So I did hit a point at some point this year where I thought, is this gonna happen? Like, generally my mood is not very good and I'm working. It was a full year of working, while in 2019, finishing my degree, I had a few months of unemployment, which was great for reading. So yes, all of that is to say I was a bit unsure how my reading would go in 2020. I read 67 books. I gave you like a few stats, numbers. I always think they're fun to look at. So of those 67 books, 20 were non-fiction and 47 were fiction books, which I think is interesting because in the 8 favourite books that I want to give you today, only 1, 2, 3, 4 are fiction. So that's an even 50-50 split, which means that generally I did rate non-fiction higher than fiction. I rated non-fiction on average 3.7 and fiction 3.2. So I thought I would just jump right in and talk to you about the 8 favourite books that I had, and they also illustrate a little bit about my reading on the whole this year. The only book that I still have standing on my shelves, but I won't, it's this orange one there, is When I Hit You by Meena Kandasamy. This one, all of these I rated 5 stars. This one on average is rated 4.1 on Goodreads, and is just a really linguistically interesting set up story of domestic abuse. A woman who marries an academic, so already this is a representation that we don't see loads of when we talk about domestic abuse. Usually it's sort of dealt with as a sort of sticky thing we don't really talk about, and surely this only happens in socioeconomically poorer families, which of course is rubbish. So this one was a really interesting lens. She's an Indian author as well, which in this case is not representative of how across the board I read. I did have a look at the numbers, and only 3 books that I read in the entire year were translated books, and When I Hit You is not translated, it's written in English. So this one I recommend to everyone who's interested in a bit more interestingly put together stories, in the sense that we have these 2 timelines, her stuck in this toxic relationship and her having escaped and gone back to her family, and that also, they don't necessarily welcome her with open arms due to the culture and the religion that the story is embedded in. So I thought this was an excellent read. It's also, like I said, the only one that is still standing on my shelves. One more in this list is a book that I owned in physical format, but I've lent it out to my mum, who I hope will read it. But on the whole, I read a lot of books in digital format. Now, you could say that that's because I wanted to read newer releases, or I wanted to save money, or there was a pandemic going on and shops were closed, so I didn't buy as much. But actually, I think that gives a bit of a skewed impression. I think the more correct conclusion is that I should just trust that I am a mood reader. So I read digitally whenever I'm sitting around, I'm looking at all my unread books on my shelves, and I'm thinking, nah, none of that is right. I want to read that book, and then I read it. So to also look a bit more at my spending, I think that would be a wise thing to do, to not get too bogged down with having to read books that are on my shelves. In fact, I think one of the things I want to do at the beginning of the year, sort of in springtime cleaning, is go through all my unread books. I'm pointing this way because all of these are unread, and actually just go through them and maybe pass some of them on to homes that would be a bit more grateful and actually read them, because I'm not doing that. The next book that I rated 5 stars and that I want to talk about is Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, by Youre Gottlieb. The subtitle I wrote down is A Therapist, Her Therapist, and Our Lives Revealed. So this is a nonfiction by Youre Gottlieb, who is a trained therapist, and she, after a breakup, sort of spirals and ends up going into therapy herself. Now, I repeat very often that I studied psychology, and I have a really difficult relationship to therapy on the whole, in as much as that I think everyone could profit from therapy, and yet I feel like I shouldn't need it. I realize this is really not a sensible or intellectual, or I don't know, just correct thing to say, but this book was really important to me because she does touch upon that weird relationship between being a therapist, thinking that you've learned all these skills, and what should therapy still show you? You already know all these things. And so that was really good because, of course, she does profit from going to therapy. And she also talks about patients that she's had in the past, and they're very moving stories, unsurprisingly, and actually made me tear up every now and then, which does not happen very often when I read, so I can wholeheartedly recommend this one. Very much in my wheelhouse, though. Reading about mental health is something that I'm generally interested in, so this one was a home run. The book that I mentioned that my mum has currently and will hopefully read soon is Lab Girl by Hope Jahren. I absolutely fell in love with this book. Hope Jahren is a biologist, a professor, and she talks about her path through academia, becoming a professor, and there are just some really, really beautiful elements here. On the one hand, of sort of the nature writing side of nonfiction, which I've learned to love, but also her family background, her career progression. She talks about friendship, which is a huge element in this book as well. And I just thought this was, I guess, a memoir just done really, really well, because at no point do you feel like you're sort of reading this sort of self-involved, arrogant recalling of a life, which sometimes I cynically think can happen with memoirs or biographies, and at the same time she just touches on topics that I think are really, really interesting. Then went on, I went on rather, to read her second book, The Story of More, which I've not listed, although now I'm talking about it, I guess, but I haven't officially listed it as one of my favourite books. I did give this 5 stars as well, though, and this is all about climate change and our role in it and what we can do in the future. So obviously she's coming from that trained biologist side of things, and just recommend Hope Jahren. I will pick up anything she chooses to write in the future. The next non-fiction book that I also rated 5 stars was Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. She's a British author, and that is also what I thought was so valuable about this non-fiction book about being black, racism, with the focus on the UK, which is something that I've not picked up on loads. I made an effort to read a book by a German author about racism and being black in Germany this year, because I thought that was interesting, was important, but that was also primed by me reading this book, realizing, wait a minute, I'm reading all these books that are focused on the US, but I don't live in America, and I'm almost oblivious to what's going on in countries that are more closer to home. So this was a really good look at that one. It also has some reflections on the history of Great Britain as well, when it comes to colonialism, slave trade, and that is also something that I don't hear talked about that much, and also it was just really well written, which is true for all of the books that made it onto my very top list. Next, I have 3 fiction books that are all very different, but I rated all of them 5 stars. The first is The Deep by River Solomons. River Solomons writes this amazing short novel about a mere folk, like mer people, and they are the descendants of pregnant slave women thrown over the boards of ships because they are sick or another mouth to feed, or for various other horrible reasons, die in the ocean, and the babies that are born are then turned into this merfolk. So such a unique blend of fantasy, fable, lyrical writing, because this book also was done together with musicians, I believe. There's like there was a whole project around it of like writing music, and this novel, I'm not actually sure where the cutoff line is between that. It was a result of the sort of literary part of that project. I don't know, words fail me to describe The Deep. We have different chapters from the point of view of different characters. Very interesting also, because the different characters that are followed in this book, the main character is the one who her task is to keep all the pain and memory, especially of her folk, so that they don't have to suffer, burdened by the horrible history of their people. She's the main character, but there are others, and the book really plays with the definition of gender and how you self-define. The author is non-binary, so I trust that the information and the wording going into this book really profited from that as well. Really interesting and completely different to many other things that I've read this year. I buddy read Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo with a friend via Bookstagram, actually, Instagram, and that was really fun. Girl, Woman, Other, again, plays around with the narrative quite a bit, in as much as that the text doesn't have any punctuation. Which I didn't know going into the book. I opened the first page and thought, oh no, look, someone being clever, and then pushed on a few more pages and was absolutely engrossed. We follow 12 different women in and around London, I believe. Is it only London? Well, it's all in the UK. And it's I don't know, it's a total love letter in a way to friendship, love, self-development. It is a bit tricky getting into the book because these 12 chapters for a person each are then subdivided into 4 parts. So 3 chapters always sort of form a chunk, and the 3 characters are somehow connected. So it may be, I don't know, a mother, a daughter, and grandmother, or I don't know, career woman, her assistant and her sister. I don't know, these aren't actually the examples in the book, but along those lines. And then among those chunks there is some overlap connection as well. I don't know, I'm making this more complicated than it needs to be. One thinks going into the book that it is going to be complicated, and it's not a book that to just sort of like turn off your brain necessarily, but some really, really strong stories that will still stay with me now that it's been a few months that I read this book. It's also actually the longest book I read in 2020. Not necessarily long, I think it comes in at something like 450 pages. Just shows that I didn't read a lot of very long books this year, and that maybe I should, because as I said, I was going to use these favourite books to sort of point me in the right direction this year, so maybe I shouldn't just focus on reading shorter books. I think my average page count was something like 200 and I wrote it actually down, 272. Something about 272 was my average page count, and I'm not forcing myself to push that, but I just want to be less afraid of picking up longer books this year, which is another reason why I'm not going to increase my Goodreads reading goal either. And then the third and final fiction book that I read and gave 5 stars to was Red, White and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, and I'm totally surprised that I rated it so highly, to be honest. I tend to be a bit more critical of romance books. I quite like reading romance books. I read a fair amount, but as you can tell, none of them have made my top list yet. And Red, White and Royal Blue, everyone I think has read so far, is a love story between the son of the American president, the president of the United States, and the son of the British royal family. That's their love story. And I shouldn't have loved this. I don't know. Royals romance is not really my kind of thing. But yeah, I just thought the relationship between them was really, really believable. They actually talk with each other, which is something I miss in a lot of romance stories, and just generally had a great time with this. I read it as an audiobook. I listened to it as an audiobook, which is also something I tend to usually not love doing, but with this one, I don't know, all bets were off. I absolutely loved it and recommend it. And then the final book that I'm going to leave you with, which is my last 5-star read of the year, and thus is still quite fresh in my mind, is You're the Only One I've Told by Dr. Mira Shaw. And this book was quite intense for me. It is stories of people who have abortions, and the author does especially talk about the United States, and this again leaning back to the Rini Eddie Lodge book, this again has showed me how I do want to learn a bit more about where I live, because hearing quite a lot of legislature behind abortions in the United States made me realize that I actually am not that well informed when it comes to Germany, which is ridiculous. I'm a woman living in Germany. I should know about my rights. And this one on the whole was just really moving. There were some aspects in this book that I wasn't necessarily expecting. There were a few stories of abortions of children that were very much wanted, but then over the course of the pregnancy it was discovered that they would be very, very sick, in pain, likely to die very young. And the thought and decision that has to go into making that decision, if it's actually a wanted, much hoped for pregnancy, I thought that was really, really tough to hear about, read about. But yeah, also just a very diverse book. I did appreciate that. The author does make sure to emphasize that this is not just a a women's issue, not only because men are also affected by this and should also care, but also because there are trans, non-binary people who may be pregnant or have children. So she's very good in the book at using pronouns to go with all the stories, and does it so matter-of-factly, so naturally, that I thought that was really cool. You sort of stumble over it a few times if you're not used to that being integrated in your books, but then you get used to it, and I think that is the way forward also, to just do it so naturally that people don't think it's complicated to use that kind of language. My stance generally is, so what if it's complicated? If people feel safer and heard and accepted through a bit more complicated language, I think that's worth it. But also it illustrates that this doesn't have to be as difficult, cumbersome, complicated as some people might think. So those 8 books I rated 5 stars. I will mull them over a little bit, and I'm quite happy with my fiction non-fiction divide, to be honest. If sort of a rough third is non-fiction, I think that's cool. But also I don't want to set myself goals when it comes to that. The only goals that I do have is that I want to tackle this unread shelf situation, because obviously I'm not picking them up and not really wanting to pick them up. I also want to stick with reading more non-fiction in audio format because I love doing that. I want to have a little think about how I feel about the fact that only 13 of my 67 books read were written by men. I think that, I don't know, I'm not sure what that says. Is that just because the type of books I'm picking up? Is it total coincidence? Have I made more of an effort to read books about sort of feminist issues, which largely are written by women? Not sure what I think about that one. I'm slightly discontent with only 3 books having been translated works. 4 books of my final number that I read were German books, which is also quite little if you consider that my native tongue is German. German, English, bilingual, but I prefer to read in English because I think my whole schooling, well, not my whole schooling, but my whole studies was in English, so it feels a bit more comfortable in a way. So I'm not sure, maybe I should push myself to sprinkle in the odd German book, but I'm not gonna set hard and fast rules. This is a hard and fast rule and something we're gonna have to look at. But on the whole, I read some great books last year. It was a good reading year despite all the rest, and I'm happy that I was able to push on and read even when I wasn't feeling that great, because it's something I do struggle with. Usually I'm feeling low, I don't really have the energy to read, but at the same time it does make me feel better. So that's something I definitely want to keep just as a sort of mental health routine, to force myself, in that case, to read even when I'm not doing very well. Let me know what your favourite book of 2020 was. I don't know, that's what we're here for, to talk about great books. I've also made the conscious decision not to make a video about my most disappointing books or the books I've liked the least. So if you do want to have a bit more of a varied impression of books that I would not recommend or that I did read despite not really liking them, head on to my Goodreads because they're all there. I hope you have a good 2021 and happy reading. Bye guys.